Someone get this civilian out of my tactical operations center. Now, the voice of Lieutenant Davies cut through the low hum of the servers like a shard of glass, sharp, arrogant, and accustomed to instant obedience. The handful of junior airmen and NCOs hunched over their consoles flinched, their typing faltering for a split second. They laughed, a nervous, uncertain sound that sought to curry favor with the new officer. The lieutenant stood, chest puffed out in his freshly pressed flight suit, a beacon of unearned authority in the dim, blue-lit cavern of the simulator control room. His target was a small woman seated at the master command node, a station no one but the chief engineer was ever supposed to touch. She wore simple gray fatigues with no rank insignia, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, functional bun. She hadn't looked up, her attention fixed on the cascade of diagnostic code scrolling across the main screen. She was the picture of calm, an island of stillness in a room suddenly charged with his manufactured tension. But the lieutenant saw only a civilian, a contractor, a woman who was, in his estimation, out of place. He saw weakness. He saw an opportunity to assert his dominance on his first day commanding this unit. When the general saw her stance, her absolute lack of reaction, a flicker of something other than amusement crossed his face from his observation post behind the one-way glass. But Davies, blinded by his own reflection in the polished floor, saw nothing but his next move. "Did you hear me? I gave an order." He strode forward, the sound of his boots unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. He came to a stop directly behind her chair. Still, she did not move. Her fingers remained poised over the keyboard, her focus absolute. It was this silence, this utter refusal to acknowledge his presence, that tipped his fragile ego over the edge. He reached down, his hand closing around the tight knot of her hair. He yanked. Her head was pulled back, forcing her to look away from the screen and up toward the ceiling. The room held its breath. It was a shocking, profound violation, a line crossed that no one had anticipated. A young sergeant started to rise from his seat, a protest forming on his lips, but the withering glare from Davies froze him in place. The lieutenant leaned in close, his voice a low, condescending sneer meant for the entire room to hear. "MITOC," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You will show respect. You will acknowledge a superior officer. You are a guest here, and you will remember that. Now get out." He released her abruptly, her head falling forward. She didn't stumble. She didn't cry out. She simply brought a hand up, not to the back of her head where he had grabbed her, but to readjust her glasses, pushing them back up the bridge of her nose with a single, steady finger. Then, her hands returned to the keyboard, her posture unchanged, her focus once more locked on the screen as if he were nothing more than a gnat, a momentary, insignificant distraction that had already been forgotten. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where respect for the lieutenant had once been. If you believe that true authority is earned in silence, not shouted from a soapbox, type competence in the comments below. The air in the simulator control room remained thick with a toxic mixture of humiliation and suspense. Lieutenant Davies stood over the woman, his face a mask of crimson fury. Her complete and utter dismissal of him was a greater insult than any shouted retort could ever have been. It was as if he didn't register on her threat matrix, as if his rank, his voice, his physical assault were all just noise in the data stream she was analyzing. For the other personnel in the room, the moment stretched into an eternity. They were caught between the rigid chain of command that demanded they obey the lieutenant and the profound, instinctual knowledge that they were witnessing something deeply wrong. They were soldiers, trained to respect the uniform, but they were also human beings who recognized the quiet dignity in the woman's stillness and the loud vulgarity in the officer's rage. The young sergeant who had almost stood up now stared at his own console, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. He felt a hot shame crawl up his neck, shame for his own inaction, for his complicity in the lieutenant's abuse. He and the others had worked with the quiet woman for 3 days as she calibrated the new simulation software. They didn't know her name, only that she was sent from higher to install the Ethelred upgrade, a notoriously complex combat simulation engine that was supposed to be the most realistic wargaming tool ever designed. She spoke little, offering only concise, technical instructions. She ate her meals alone, reading dense technical manuals. She was an enigma, unassuming and almost invisible, yet her presence had a weight to it, a seriousness that the lieutenant, with all his bluster, fundamentally lacked. Davies, feeling the eyes of the room on him, knew he had to reassert control. He had committed to this path of confrontation and could not back down without losing face entirely. He interpreted her silence not as profound self-control, but as defiant insubordination. He was about to speak again, to escalate further, perhaps to have her physically removed by the military police, when a klaxon alarm, shrill and piercing, ripped through the room. Red lights began to flash, bathing every surface in an apocalyptic glow. On the main screen, the scrolling green diagnostic code vanished, replaced by a single, blinking word in massive block letters. Cascade. It was a word that struck a primal fear into the heart of every operator in that room. A cascade failure was the ultimate nightmare scenario, a self-perpetuating chain reaction of system errors that, in the real world, could lead to the loss of $1 billion satellite, the meltdown of a reactor, or the complete collapse of a command and control network. In the Ethelred simulation, it was the digital equivalent of a death sentence, a situation from which there was no programmed recovery. The system was designed to teach pilots and operators how to manage failure, but a full-blown cascade was designed to teach them only one thing: humility. It was the Kobayashi Maru of their world. Davies spun toward the main screen, his personal grievance momentarily forgotten in the face of a professional crisis. "What is that? What's happening?" he demanded, his voice cracking with sudden panic. The chief engineer, a master sergeant with 20 years of experience, was already racing through checklists, his face pale. "Sir, it's a total system failure. All primary systems are offline. Redundancies are failing. It's eating itself alive, sir. I've never seen anything like it. The safeties aren't holding. The core is corrupting." The room erupted into a controlled chaos of shouted reports and frantic typing as the operators tried to isolate their subsystems. But it was useless. On the tactical map, friendly units began to blink out of existence, consumed by the digital cancer spreading through the network. The simulation was not just failing, it was being erased. And in the center of it all, the woman, Anya Morgan, remained perfectly still, her eyes scanning the torrent of error messages with an unnerving, analytical calm. The chaos in the Tactical Operations Center was a symphony of escalating panic. Alarms blared in a dissonant chorus, each one signaling another critical subsystem spiraling into oblivion. The master sergeant was shouting technical jargon into his headset, his voice strained with desperation as he tried to enact emergency protocols that were being systematically ignored by the collapsing system. Negative command. The purge command is not responding. I've lost manual override on the primary coolant simulation. The core temperature is critical. Lieutenant Davies, stripped of his arrogant bravado, was now just a frightened man in a room full of flashing red lights. He was a pilot, trained to handle emergencies in the sky, but this was different. This was a ground war against an enemy he couldn't see, a ghost in the machine that was dismantling his reality one line of code at a time. He barked orders that were either impossible to execute or irrelevant to the crisis. "Reboot the system. Just pull the plug," he yelled, a suggestion so naive that the master sergeant didn't even bother to respond. A hard reboot during a cascade failure would be like trying to fix a crumbling building by detonating a bomb in the basement. It would guarantee the total, unrecoverable loss of the entire simulation and its priceless data. The entire multi-million-dollar Ethelred project would be reduced to digital slag. In the midst of this pandemonium, Anya Morgan finally moved. It was not a sudden or panicked movement, but a deliberate, fluid motion, like a predator that had finished observing and was now ready to act. Her hands, which had been poised above her keyboard, descended, and then they began to move. It was not typing as the others understood it. It was a blur, a frantic, rhythmic dance of fingers across the keys that was too fast for the eye to properly follow. It was a virtuoso performance of muscle memory and pure intellect. On her dedicated screen, a command line interface, a black void invisible to the others, opened up. Green text began to pour across it, faster than any human could read. She wasn't using the system's graphical interface. She had bypassed it entirely. She was in the machine's deepest level, speaking its native language, the raw source code that was the very bedrock of its existence. She didn't try to stop the cascade. The other operators watched, mesmerized, as she seemed to ignore the primary failures entirely. Instead, she was building something. With keystrokes that were like a master weaver throwing a shuttlecock, she began to construct a virtual cage of code around a corrupted core. She was creating new protocols from scratch, forging digital firewalls where none had existed, rerouting phantom power through non-existent subroutines. She was not fighting the fire. She was redirecting the river, carving a new path for the destructive energy to flow, a path that led it away from the critical systems and into a quarantine partition she was fabricating in real time. Her face was a mask of pure concentration. Her breathing was steady and even. The chaos of the room, the alarms, the shouting, all of it had ceased to exist for her. There was only the code, the cascading logic, and her will. She was a surgeon performing open-heart surgery in the middle of a hurricane, her hands moving with an impossible, preternatural steadiness. The master sergeant stopped what he was doing and just stared, his mouth slightly agape. He was a good engineer, one of the best, but what he was witnessing was not engineering. It was something else entirely. It was artistry. It was magic. The transformation of the room was gradual, then sudden. The frantic shouts of the operators died down one by one, replaced by a stunned, reverent silence. They turned from their own failing consoles to watch the woman at the master command node. The only sounds now were the lingering, rhythmic pulse of the warning klaxons and the impossibly fast, soft click-clack of her keyboard. It was the sound of creation, of order being forged from chaos. On the main tactical display, something extraordinary began to happen. The cascading tide of red, which had been consuming the entire map, began to slow. Its advance halted. Then, like a retreating wave, it began to recede. A thin, bright green line appeared, encircling the corrupted data, corralling it, containing it. It was the virtual firewall she had built, a digital fortress erected in seconds. The operators watched in awe as she began the second phase of her counterattack. She wasn't just containing the failure. She was repurposing it. The rogue code, a vortex of destructive energy, was now being harnessed. With a series of complex commands, she transformed the cascade's own chaotic processing power into a tool. She was using the virus to heal the system. She isolated the core's corrupted memory blocks and, instead of trying to purge them, she began to rewrite them, using the very energy of the cascade to power the recompilation. It was like watching someone take the full force of a tidal wave and channel it through a turbine to generate electricity. It was an act of breathtaking conceptual brilliance. The red warning lights on the hardware banks flickered, wavered, and then, one by one, they turned a steady, solid green. The piercing wail of the klaxons sputtered and died, plunging the room into a silence that was deeper and more profound than the noise it replaced. The master tactical map, which moments before had been a sea of catastrophic red, was now completely green. In the center of the screen, where the cascade warning had blared, a new message appeared in the same block letters. System stable. Diagnostic complete. All systems nominal. Then, below it, a line of text that no one in that room had ever seen the simulator produce. Threat neutralized. 0 losses. It was an impossible result. The Ethelred system was designed so that a cascade failure always resulted in catastrophic losses. It was a fundamental rule of the simulation. She hadn't just beaten the simulation. She had broken its most basic law. Anya Morgan's fingers slowed, then stopped. She executed one final command, a simple keystroke that locked the console. She leaned back in her chair, the first sign of relaxation she had shown since the incident began. She took a slow, deep breath and blinked, her eyes readjusting to the room around her, as if returning from a great distance. The silence held for a full 10 seconds. It was the silence of a congregation that had just witnessed a miracle. Every eye was on her. Lieutenant Davies stood frozen, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, shock, disbelief, and a dawning, horrifying sense of his own monumental foolishness. The woman he had assaulted, the civilian he had tried to eject, had just single-handedly saved a multi-million-dollar defense project in under 2 minutes. performing a feat of technical wizardry that the most experienced engineer on the base had believed to be impossible. His arrogance had shattered, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The master sergeant finally found his voice, a choked whisper filled with awe. "No way," he breathed, staring at the screen. "That's not possible." Into the thick, stunned silence of the control room, a new presence made itself known. A door at the back of the room hissed open, a door that led to the darkened observation chamber where senior officers monitored training exercises. Captain Hayes stepped through, his face unreadable. He was the company commander, a man in his late 40s with graying temples and eyes that held the quiet, steady weight of decades of command. He was known for his calm demeanor and his almost supernatural ability to see through nonsense. He had witnessed the entire event, from Lieutenant Davies' arrogant confrontation to the woman's impossible display of competence. The room tensed further at his arrival. The junior personnel snapped to a semblance of attention. Captain Hayes' gaze swept across the room, past the panicked faces of the operators, past the now ghostly pale Lieutenant Davies, and settled directly on the small woman in the chair. He walked forward, his steps measured and deliberate, his boots making no sound on the raised flooring. He did not look at the main screen, at the impossible all-systems nominal message. He didn't need to. He had seen enough. He stopped not behind her, as Davies had, but beside her, affording her the respect of his presence. He looked down at her, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, a deep, profound, almost reverent respect. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the effortless authority that Davies had tried so desperately to fake. "I had a feeling that was you. It's been a long time." The use of the word ma'am was a thunderclap in the silent room. It was a term of respect reserved for female officers or senior NCOs, not for an anonymous civilian contractor. Anya Morgan finally turned her head to look at him, a faint, ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Captain," she acknowledged, her voice soft but clear. "You're looking well," Lieutenant Davies stared, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Captain Hayes ignored him completely. He turned to the master sergeant. "Sergeant," he commanded, "bring up the personnel file for our guest. Authorization code Hayes, Alpha 7-9. Access Project Chimera Archives." The sergeant, shaking himself from his stupor, scrambled to his keyboard. The Chimera Archives were classified above top secret, a level of clearance most people on the base didn't even know existed. A few keystrokes, a password entry, and a new file bloomed onto a side monitor. Captain Hayes walked over to it, ensuring everyone in the room, especially Lieutenant Davies, could see the screen clearly. The file was sparse, much of it redacted, but what was visible was staggering. Name, Morgan, Anya. Rank, Chief Warrant Officer 5. A CW-5, the highest, most respected, and rarest of the warrant officer ranks. They were living legends, technical and tactical masters of their craft, advisors to generals and institutional linchpins. A CW-5 was so senior that they were afforded the customs and courtesies of a full colonel, and in their technical domain, their authority was absolute. Davies felt the blood drain from his face. A lieutenant berating a CW-5 was unthinkable. A lieutenant laying hands on one was a career-ending, court-martial-worthy offense. But it was the lines below her rank that truly stole the breath from a room. Unit, redacted, medals, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Second Oak Leaf Cluster, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star with V device. And then the final devastating line. Primary specialization. Lead architect and principal coder, Project Ethelred. She hadn't just fixed the simulation. She had created it. The silence in the room was now one of pure, unadulterated shock. The credentials on the screen did not compute with the quiet, unassuming woman sitting in the chair. It was like discovering that the janitor was secretly a Nobel laureate in physics. Chief Warrant Officer 5. The rank itself was a myth to most of the junior personnel, a ghost story told in the barracks about operators so skilled they existed outside the normal chain of command. A CW-5 had forgotten more about their specialty than a general would ever know. They were the keepers of the flame, the high priests of the military's most esoteric arts. Captain Hayes let the information sink in, his eyes fixed on Lieutenant Davies, who looked as if he might faint. The captain's voice, when he finally spoke, was cold, precise, and utterly unforgiving. "Lieutenant," he said, his words dropping like chips of ice into the silence. "For the last 3 days, you have had a living legend in your midst. You have had the chief architect of the most advanced tactical simulation in our arsenal, a woman who has forgotten more about cyber warfare than you will ever learn, sitting in your TOC, and you treated her like she was something you scraped off your boot." He took a step toward Davies, who involuntarily took a step back. "That civilian is Chief Warrant Officer Anya Morgan. Her work has saved the lives of men and women in operational theaters you are not even cleared to know exist. The simulation you are running, the very platform you are supposed to be mastering, she wrote the core code, on a dare, over a weekend. The cascade failure you just witnessed wasn't a glitch. It was a final exam, a hidden stress test she designed to see if the hardware could handle the theoretical limits of the engine. No one has ever beaten it. It was not designed to be beaten. The revelation landed like a physical blow. The entire crisis had been a test that everyone, especially the lieutenant, had failed spectacularly until the examiner herself had stepped in to grade her own paper. Captain Hayes wasn't finished. He pointed a rigid finger at Davies. "You put your hands on a senior officer, but that is the least of your offenses. You demonstrated a catastrophic failure of judgment. You chose arrogance over curiosity. You chose prejudice over professionalism. You saw a woman, so you assumed she was subordinate. You saw no rank, so you assumed she had no authority. You have demonstrated to me, and to every single person in this room, that you do not possess the single most important quality of a leader, the wisdom to recognize when you are in the presence of an expert." He paused, letting the weight of his words crush the young officer. He then turned his back on Davies, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. He walked back to Anya Morgan's side. He drew himself up to his full height, his posture shifting from that of a commander to that of a subordinate. He raised his hand in a slow, perfect salute, his eyes locked on hers. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now filled with undisguised admiration. "On behalf of my command, I apologize for the unprofessional reception you have received. We are in your debt." Chief Warrant Officer Morgan looked up at him, and then at the stunned faces of the young operators around the room. She returned the salute with a crisp, economical motion. "The hardware is sound, Captain," she said softly. "The software is stable. The personnel might need a little more work." The story of what happened in Simulator 7 spread through the base like a shockwave. It traveled not through official channels, but through the military's oldest and most efficient communication network, gossip. It was whispered in the Chow Hall line, recounted with embellishments in the smoky haze of the NCO club, and typed into hushed chat messages between different squadrons. The tale acquired a name, the Lieutenant's Folly, or, more poetically, the day the Ghost wrote code, Lieutenant Davies became an instant pariah. His public humiliation was absolute and inescapable. He was not formally charged. Captain Hayes, and presumably Chief Morgan, had decided that the loss of respect was a far more potent and lasting punishment than a court-martial. Davies was quietly and unceremoniously reassigned to a logistics depot in the most remote, forgotten corner of the globe, a place known for counting pallets and processing paperwork. His career as a line officer was over before it had truly begun. His name became a cautionary tale, a verb used by NCOs to warn young, arrogant officers. Don't go pulling a Davies, but while his story was one of shame, Anya Morgan's became one of legend. She was the ghost of Sim 7, the quiet professional who had humbled an officer with silence and saved a system with skill. The operators who had been in the room that day were elevated by their proximity to the event. They were sought out, asked to recount every detail. They spoke of her with a reverence usually reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. They described the blur of her hands on the keyboard, the absolute calm on her face amidst the chaos, the cold fire in Captain Hayes' eyes as he delivered the final vindication. The Master Command node, where she had worked, was unofficially cordoned off. The Master Sergeant placed a small, laminated plaque next to it, which simply read, "The Morgan Station. Be humble. Be competent." It became a point of pilgrimage for tech-savvy airmen and NCOs. They would stand before it, not touching, just looking at the keyboard that had channeled a miracle. Anya Morgan herself, true to her nature, vanished as quietly as she had appeared. The day after the incident, She was gone. No forwez, no debería fin. She simply wasn't there. But her presence lingered. She had left behind more than just a stable simulation. She had left a lesson burned into the institutional memory of the base. She had reminded them that competence is quiet, that authority is earned, not conferred, and that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you don't notice. Her legacy was not in the code she wrote, but in the culture she corrected. She had, in one brief, explosive encounter, recalibrated the moral compass of an entire wing, reminding them to judge by the content of one's character and the quality of one's work, not by the insignia on a collar or the assumptions of prejudiced eye. The ripples of that day continued to expand long after Chief Warrant Officer Morgan had departed. Captain Hayes, a man who understood the value of a teachable moment, institutionalized the legend. He made the story of the Morgan Station a mandatory part of the orientation for every new officer and NCO assigned to his command. He would personally walk them into Simulator 7, stand them before the simple plaque, and tell the story. He would not spare Davies' reputation, using his failure as a stark and powerful lesson on the dangers of arrogance and the poison of prejudice. Your rank, he would tell the young lieutenants, their faces a mixture of awe and fear, gives you the authority to give orders. It does not give you the right to be listened to. That you must earn. You will earn it with humility, with respect, and with the competence to know when to speak and, more importantly, when to listen. In this command, we do not tolerate gatekeepers. We value skill, regardless of the vessel it comes in. You never know when the unassuming civilian contractor sitting in the corner is the one who wrote the book, the test, and the answer key, the story changed people. Young officers, who might have been tempted to lead with bluster, learned to lead with questions. They learned to seek out the quiet experts, the seasoned sergeants, and the quiet warrant officers, and to listen to their counsel. The culture of the unit began to shift, becoming more collaborative, more efficient, and more respectful. Competence became the ultimate currency, valued above all else. The operators who had been present that day carried the memory as a personal touchstone. The young sergeant who had almost stood up to Davies found his courage. A few months later, he respectfully but firmly corrected a visiting colonel on a technical matter, citing the system's operational parameters. The colonel, a man of Captain Hayes' vintage, listened, nodded, and thanked him for his professional diligence. It was a small victory, but it was a direct echo of Morgan's lesson, that speaking truth to power is not insubordination when the truth is grounded in expertise. The legend of Anya Morgan became a foundational myth for the unit, a story that defined its identity and its values. It served as a constant reminder that true strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but the calmest mind. It was about the quiet, methodical application of skill in the face of chaos. It was about the deafening power of demonstrated competence. Her ghost lingered in the humming servers and the glowing screens, a silent guardian of the principle that what you do will always, in the end, speak more powerfully than what you say. Years passed. Captain Hayes was promoted to major, then lieutenant colonel, and he took the story of Anya Morgan with him to every new command, planting the seeds of her legacy across the Air Force. The Ethelred simulation she had designed and perfected became the gold standard for tactical training, saving countless lives by preparing soldiers for the unimaginable horrors of modern warfare in the safety of a virtual world. The Morgan Cascade Test, as it was now officially known, was no longer a hidden exam, but the final graduation requirement for all elite cyber warfare operators. It was still considered unbeatable. To this day, no one has ever successfully navigated it. The goal was not to win, but to manage the failure, to mitigate the damage, to last as long as possible against the ghost in the machine, to fail with grace, and to learn from the humbling. The story itself evolved, as all legends do. The details became grander, her keystrokes faster, the lieutenant's insults more cartoonishly evil. But the core truth of the tale remained intact, a pure, unchanging moral at the heart of the myth. It was a story about respect, not the false respect demanded by a uniform, but the true respect commanded by mastery. It was a parable for a new age of warfare, where the decisive battle might not be fought with bombs and bullets, but with lines of code and the quiet brilliance of a single, focused mind. The lesson was that in the complex, interconnected world of the 21st century, assumptions are a liability. Judging a book by its cover can get you killed, or, in the case of Lieutenant Davies, get you exiled to a lifetime of bureaucratic obscurity. The true measure of a person is not their title, their gender, their age, or their appearance. It is the depth of their knowledge and the steadiness of their hands under pressure. Anya Morgan was never seen on that base again. She remained a ghost, a name in a classified file, a legend whispered in the halls. But her actions created a legacy far more enduring than any statue or monument. It was a living legacy woven into the DNA of the unit, passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next. It was a legacy of quiet competence, of professional humility, and of the unassailable truth that a person's real rank is not what is pinned to their collar, but what is etched into their soul. True legacy isn't what you say about yourself. It's the stories others tell about you after you've left the room. It is the standard you set, the example you become, and the change you inspire in those who witnessed your truth. It is the quiet, undeniable proof that character is, and always will be, the ultimate authority. The ultimate triumph of that day was not in the saving of a machine, but in the reforging of a culture. The story of Chief Warrant Officer Morgan became more than just an anecdote. It became a doctrine. It was a powerful, human-scale illustration of a principle that the military had always preached but sometimes failed to practice: that meritocracy must be absolute. The incident forced a reckoning with the subtle, often unconscious biases that can fester in any large, hierarchical organization. The image of Lieutenant Davies grabbing her by the hair became a potent symbol of institutional arrogance, a visual shorthand for the kind of lazy prejudice that corrodes unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. Conversely, the image of Morgan's calm, steady hands flying over the keyboard became an icon of true professionalism. It was a testament to the idea that in moments of genuine crisis, the superficial markers of authority, rank, title, volume, become meaningless. All that matters is the signal in the noise, the clear, coherent, and effective response of a true expert. The tale taught a generation of leaders that their primary job was not to have all the answers, but to create an environment where the people with the right answers felt empowered to give them, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. It taught them to be talent scouts, to look past the surface and identify the quiet, unassuming individuals who possessed deep, often hidden, wells of skill. The Morgan Station remained in Simulator 7, not as a memorial, but as a classroom. Instructors would use it to challenge their students. If Chief Morgan were standing behind you right now, they would ask a struggling operator, what would she see? Would she see panic, or would she see a professional methodically working the problem? The question was a call to a higher standard, a challenge to emulate her legendary composure and clarity of thought. The story's influence even bled out into the civilian contracting world. Companies that worked with the military began to hear whispers of the Morgan Standard. It became a reminder that the specialists they sent into sensitive environments needed not only technical skill, but also the quiet confidence and humility to integrate seamlessly with their military counterparts. The legend of Anya Morgan thus became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By telling a story that championed quiet competence, the organization began to select for and promote that very trait. The loud, arrogant gatekeepers like Davies found themselves increasingly marginalized, while the quiet professionals, the problem solvers, the ones who let their work speak for them, found new pathways to influence and respect. The legacy was not a static memory. It was a dynamic, evolving cultural shift. It was the quiet, steady hum of a well-run machine, the absence of chaos, the presence of a deep, institutional calm rooted in the certainty that when the next crisis came, a hand would be ready, steady, and sure to type the commands that would once again turn a cascade of red into a field of solid green. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where a person's skill defines their ultimate worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.